ladies and gentlemen, this is John. Welcome back to another episode of our weekly show, The Subcontinent. Our program aims to address important issues in the subcontinent which affect the governments, people, organizations, and the region as a whole. We will try to explain the issues, break down controversies surrounding them, and try to have some external perspectives from experts and people.
In this edition of The Subcontinent, we will take a look at the major events and news that took place throughout the year across the countries of this vast region.
This year was marred by the COVID pandemic, and the uncertainty it ensued was not only in the subcontinent, but for the entire world. The normal flow of life was disrupted by the COVID pandemic in almost all the societies, and the economic prospects are grim for the whole subcontinent. Wide-ranging lockdowns took great tolls on social and economic status of many people and industries, resulting in unemployment and unwanted migration as well as nationwide protests.
The year 2020 will be remembered in future history books as the year that one of humanity's smallest enemies hit the entire planet with a shadow of doubt about the future. It impacted the political and social discourse everywhere, and the subcontinent was no exception.
2020 के तो हालात काफ़ी बहुत सारे हैं, लेकिन जिस तरह लोगों ने मनाया था और वो एक्सपेक्ट कर रहे थे कि बहुत अच्छा साल गुजरेगा, लेकिन पूरी दुनिया की इसमें इकानमी ख़राब हो गई, वर्ल्ड वाइड इकानमी इफ़ेक्ट हो गई और फर्स्ट टाइम दुनिया में एक नया चैलेंज आ गया। वो चैलेंज मेडिकल का आ गया और सबको ये पता चल गया कि वीकनेस जो है वो मेडिकल की है और सबसे ज़्यादा बजट मेडिकल पे रहना चाहिए, जिसका एक हालत कोरोना कोविड-19 के शक्ल में आया और पूरी दुनिया की इकानमी जो हो गई वो फ्रीज़ कर दी गई और पूरी दुनिया का जितना भी एयर स्पेस था सारा बैठ गया। जितनी इकानमी थी सारी फ़्लाइट्स बंद हो गई और इकानमी उससे ख़राब हो गई। ये सबसे बड़े पूरे 2020 के वाक़यात।
The first cases of the coronavirus were reported in the winter of 2020 in most of the countries, and in less than 2 or 3 months, almost all of the subcontinent started enforcing on and off nationwide lockdowns. Uncertainty about the future of the outbreak or possible lockdowns resulted in the bankruptcy and closure of numerous businesses and consequently the unemployment of workers that caused even more financial insecurity for the people. India, for instance, witnessed a colossal migration of workers from cities to their home villages as there were not enough jobs in the cities anymore.
मालिक ने यहाँ तक कि 5 दिन के पैसे और नहीं दिए जो आ रहे थे, 23 दिन के पैसे दिए, पूरे महीने के पैसे भी नहीं दिए मालिक ने.
As one of the key sources of revenue for most of the subcontinental nations such as Nepal, Maldives or Bhutan, the tourism industry was among the most disastrously hit due to the COVID-19 restrictions.
The World Bank predicts in a report that South Asia's economic outlook is grim as the region is set to plunge into its worst ever recession as the devastating impacts of COVID-19 on South Asian economies linger on. As per the norm of the world, such impacts are disproportionately costly for the ordinary workers as millions of South Asians are pushed into extreme poverty.
India's economy, the region's largest, is expected to contract by 9.6% in the fiscal year that started in March 2020. Regional growth is projected to rebound to 4.5% in 2021. Factoring in the population growth, however, income per capita in the region will remain 6% below 2019 estimates, indicating that the expected rebound will not offset the lasting economic damage caused by the pandemic. The government of Premier Narendra Modi, that was struggling economically even before the outbreak, used the downward trends as a cover to go ahead with its nationwide plan to privatize many industries and implement a wide array of reforms. His initiatives were greeted by nationwide demonstrations as different sectors were protesting for different reasons. Protests against the changes in the agriculture sector are still being held by farmers throughout the country.
today we are organizing rallies in support of the bond. Here in Calcutta we have also organized. Now we have burnt an effigy of the King of India, Modi.
In late November, a mass general strike was held across India. The strike was organized by 10 trade unions across the country and was supported by the Indian National Congress, the Marxist Communist Party of India, and some other left-wing parties. The strike saw an estimated 250 million people involved, making it the largest in history.
Not only didn't the daily battle against the disease make the tyrants feel less sympathy for their fellow humans, but also the loud global frenzy caused by the pandemic rendered the oppressed even more voiceless, as the news of their daily ordeal were less heard or even noticed. The government of Narendra Modi, which has been facing protests and riots since the introduction of the citizenship law that discriminates against Muslims, even used this opportunity to further suppress the Muslims in the entire country by arresting many high-profile Muslim activists and ordinary civilians under the cover of the coronavirus pandemic.
The suffering of Muslim minorities across the subcontinent have always been among the most underreported issues, but in 2020, stories of their ordeal were further buried under the pile of daily coverage and updates about the pandemic. In Bangladesh, the woes of Rohingyas never abate as they are deprived from the basic human rights. In February, 15 Rohingya refugees died, while another 72 were rescued when a trawler bound for Malaysia sank near St. Martin's Island in the Bay of Bengal.
Unfortunately, we are seeing the situation in Myanmar vis-a-vis Rohingyas is continuing. I mean, they are identified as the most oppressed and most persecuted community, and this is continuing. And unfortunately, it's continuing because there is no political will to address this. West and the international community are they got no political will, and this is really continuing, is becoming worse, not just inside Myanmar, but those who manage to escape the death and the torture and rape, and they're actually living in a very difficult circumstances in Bangladesh and India and elsewhere. And what is really important to recognize is that the fact that there is no political will to address this issue, it's given green light to others to go down the same route.
In September, 24 more people died after a leak in a gas pipeline caused an explosion in a mosque in Narayanganj district. In bloodier waves of attacks against Muslims, Hindu mobs killed or brutalized scores of Muslims in northeast Delhi in late February. Of the 53 people killed in the bout of violence, 2/3 were Muslims who were shot, slashed with repeated blows, or set on fire. The number of such attacks has increased since the Hindu nationalist government is in power.
We are seeing vis-a-vis what is happening in India. Muslims in India are now prosecuted, and there has been the rise of extremism and empowerment of extremism because of their connection to the Indian government, and the fact that they're getting away with murder and lynching of the Muslims. And also we've got the situation of Kashmir. Matters are becoming much worse. I think the international community needs to respond, and the lack of response by international community to address these injustices actually leading to the circumstances that the matter is getting worse. And unfortunately, I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. And unfortunately, I don't see even the Muslims around the world and OIC and others really responding adequately to this very blatant Islamophobia and the fact that Muslims seem to be a community that could be abused and oppressed across the world, and in particular in that region, and no one is going to be held accountable.
Just as the riots were ongoing in Delhi, Premier Modi hosted US President Donald Trump in such a welcoming ceremony that was unbelievable for the lame duck president. The Namaste Trump tour event held in Ahmedabad as a response to the Howdy Modi event in Texas served as a platform for the US President and the Indian Prime Minister to display their friendship and show off a $3 billion military deal.
2020 was shockingly abysmal for many people across the entire planet, but blood and tears are such frequent occurrences in some parts of the subcontinent that nothing can halt or dwindle them, not even in the face of a shared biological enemy. As Amphan and Nisarga cyclones and swarms of locusts kept ravaging large swaths of land across the virus-hit subcontinent, some human-induced hazards like gas leaks and pipeline explosions added to the misery of the people on the backdrop of border clashes and terrorist attacks. The most important rivalries of the subcontinent come down to the dynamics of ties between India, Pakistan and China. And in the year 2020, the heights of Himalayas witnessed a dizzying array of military movements and confrontations as India was engaged in skirmishes with both Pakistan and China. During an aggressive melee between India and China in May, several Indian and Chinese soldiers were at the Nathula crossing and other locations across the Sino-Indian border, including near the disputed Pangong Lake in Ladakh and the Tibet Autonomous Region, and near the border between Sikkim and the Tibet Autonomous Region. Moreover, India and Pakistan escalated their adversary to new levels over Kashmir. More than 15 people were killed along the line of control in their face-offs that are increasingly getting fierier, especially after India's change in the country's constitution on the status of the region.
तो सर वाक़यात तो बस बहुत हुए हैं, लेकिन जो याद है वो यही है कि कराची में एक वो जो PIA का त्यारा गिरा था, त्यारा नहीं वो जो उनका प्लेन था, उसमें तकरीबन ऑलमोस्ट 100+ डेथ्स हो गई थी। और वो जो एक पाकिस्तान ने इंडिया के जो तैयारी गिराए थे MiG-21, जो दैट वाज फैंटास्टिक। उनको चाय बहुत पसंद आई थी पाकिस्तान की, ये कोयटा कैफे से बन के गई थी।
Let's just take a quick look at how the global media has covered this situation.
Territorial disputes over the Kashmir region sparked two of the three major Indo-Pakistani wars in 1947 and 1965, and a limited war in 1999. Although both countries have maintained a fragile ceasefire since 2003, they regularly exchange fire across the contested border known as the Line of Control. Both sides accuse the other of violating the ceasefire and claim to be shooting in response to attacks. An uptick to border skirmishes that began in late 2016 and continued into 2018 killed dozens and displaced thousands of civilians on both sides of the line of control. This year has been particularly violent. The June clash in the Galwan Valley, fought with sticks and clubs, not guns, was the first fatal confrontation between the two sides since 1975, and relations have continued to deteriorate. India acknowledged its deaths. China did not comment on reports it also suffered fatalities. If neither side gives way, the standoff could have destabilizing consequences for the region. If they come to blows again, there is a risk of escalation between the world's most populous countries, both established nuclear powers. Usually, the locust swarms enter India through Pakistan for summer breeding in June or July with the advent of the monsoon. But this year, Indian officials say the pink swarm started much earlier in April because of presence of residual population in Pakistan that couldn't be controlled last season. Pink immature adults fly high and cover long distances during daytime hours before settling on trees at night. They are very active and their mobility makes it difficult to control individual swarms.
Now, for more analysis on the current situation and future prospects in India, we are joined by Mr. Sanjay Jha, who is an Indian politician, an ex-banker, and the author of the recently published book, The Great Unraveling, India After 2014. Mr. Jha, welcome back to the show. So, for many countries around the world, 2020 would be remembered as a year of health tragedy and economic downfall. How has India been in this situation, and how do you see the handling of this situation?
Well, India has had an equally difficult period. We are a country that battled a very severe pandemic, much against the earlier expectations. And as you're aware, that after America, India has had the highest number of cases of infections of coronavirus. It has been, a challenge because of our weak public health infrastructure. And the fact that, in the urban cities of India, there's high density of population. So large sections of people were affected very, very negatively. While there has been a significant improvement over the last couple of weeks, we are still, I would say at this point of time, in the process of trying to overcome what has been a very formidable challenge. Fortunately, I do believe that at the end of the day, the people of India as a society have risen collectively together to exercise better discipline. We could have done better, but one cannot deny that there has been good public consciousness. And I would say that the central government and the state governments have at least taken it in a very, very serious intent. And to that extent, at least I'm optimistic that going forward, India should be able to contain the virus in the coming weeks, especially now that the vaccine is down the corner.
India has gone through a severe pandemic indeed, and as you said, things might improve. So some of the government's nationwide plans for privatization were greeted by nationwide demonstrations and protests. The latest one being by the farmers. Why is it like this?
Well, the fact is that the coronavirus pandemic resulted in a massive contraction of India's GDP by 23% in the first quarter, which was perhaps the worst in the entire universe. It has come down since, but we are still battling a serious economic recession. There are protests by the farmers who are very upset with the new laws. There is a lot of backlash even against labor reforms. And the reason behind that is very straightforward. India has still 22% of people living below the poverty line. That works out to almost over 300 million people. And the pandemic has worsened inequality. There has been a concentration of financial and economic resources in the hands of a few, especially the big tech companies and large, too big to fail companies. So India is actually seeing a major backlash from those who live, as they say, at the borderline. And the farmers' protest is a manifestation of a very serious crisis of inequality, poverty, and a social inequity in our system.
Mr. Jha, before continuing, let's just take a quick look at how the global media has covered this situation.
Migrant flight has serious implications on the already fragile rural health infrastructure. It is estimated that between 2 million and 10 million migrants were impacted by COVID-19. A severe impact on other health programs due to COVID-19 is also evident from the analysis of the National Health Mission data on inpatient and outpatient treatment. Between 100,000 and 200,000 children missed routine vaccinations during February and March. Treatment for tuberculosis also showed declines. Despite the rapidly rising numbers, India has reopened gyms, most workplaces and markets. Given that India has administered only 60 million tests so far, the majority of its population may yet contract the virus. But New Delhi's approach seems to prioritize protecting livelihoods, a choice perhaps influenced by the release earlier this month of quarterly data showing a 24% contraction of India's economy. Other South Asian countries seem to be faring better than India. Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan, countries whose median ages are 10, 2 and 4 years lower than that of India, respectively, have dramatically slowed the spread of the coronavirus and recorded a low number of new deaths. India is 4 times larger in area, 7 times in population and 10 times in GDP than Pakistan. Yet in the dismal realm of COVID-19, bigger numbers are nothing to boast of. Whereas India's burden is still rising by 70,000 new cases a day. Pakistan's caseload seems to have peaked 3 months ago. Its daily total of new cases has remained in the mere hundreds since early August. India's economy has also fared far worse. The Asian Development Bank predicts that its GDP will shrink by fully 9% in the current fiscal year, compared with a contraction of 0.4% for Pakistan.
All right, welcome back, Mr. Jha, and thank you to the audience as well for staying with us. So, Mr. Jha, you said that the backlash is coming from the most affected people in terms of equality and in terms of poverty. How long do you think it would take for India to recover from the impacts of the pandemic?
Technically, there are people who believe that we should be able to hit around 0% growth rate in the quarter of January to March of 2021. People are very optimistic that India may even have a V curve in some sectors where recovery is concerned. But if you look at India structurally, in terms of the informal sector, where data is very hard to capture, or the rural sector, the agricultural, shall we say, sector, these are areas where it's not easy to capture the real ground level crisis that we face. For example, the migrant crisis, which became a humanitarian problem. The record unemployment that you cannot really write off at all. It's got progressively worse. Manrega demands have gone up because there has been a reverse migration. A lot of the SME companies, which were anyway struggling, are finding it very difficult. And please do not forget that India was already struggling on the economy front at a growth rate of around 3 to 3.5% even before the pandemic. So you have seen an aggravation of India's economic woes. Technically, I do believe India might see a GDP growth rate of around 10 to 12% as a bounce back on a lower, database. But it will take at least 2 years, in my opinion, for India to begin to get the confidence that we are back in business.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Jha, for coming to our show again. It was nice having you here.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Viewers, let's see how people on social media see the events that passed 2020.
In the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, Prime Minister Imran Khan, by tweeting this tweet, mentioned the tough choice of the governments of the region in imposing lockdown or not doing so in order to save their economy. Rahul Mukherjee also refers to many poor people and workers who have suffered a lot due to the lockdown and the pandemic. Regarding the November general strike, Rizwan Rahman, as a protester, marks the ruler's brutal and inhuman treatment to workers as the main reason of the protests. And also about the issue of the minority rights, Raimi refers to the important issues such as Islamophobia, the Kashmir conflict, caste atrocities, and the Delhi violence, and considers injustice as an unchanged, deep-rooted problem. And at last, Mary Thomas opines the tensions between Muslims and Hindus are actually due more to political factors rather than the religious ones.
And that was our episode about the events that took place throughout the year across the subcontinent. To watch bits of our episodes and more updates, follow us on our social media platforms and make sure to give us feedback about what you think. We'll meet the same time, same day next week. Thanks for watching.